ASUS is the motherboard for those who dare.
I've got nothing, it's totally froze again. Oh, there you go, there you go. I got this 0D error, and this has been a recurring issue with this board. When I went to run this, I got a blue screen of death. I blue screened again. Might be the beginning and the end of it if it just keeps crashing every time I run a CPU load.
The BIOS update really plainly spells out, hey, if something goes wrong because of our BIOS, fuck you and fuck your board. You gotta give it to them. It's pretty accurate branding. You have to be very daring to want to introduce that to your home or your computer. So ASUS right now is acting either negligently or extremely maliciously in our opinions. And that's because of its absolutely panicked BIOS updates and its mixed messages on warranty support, plus what it thinks of AMD EXPO. So they're trying to resolve the self-immolating CPU problem, and if you missed that video, definitely go watch that before this one. It's a really cool video and kind of required information. But not only has ASUS's newest BIOS not fixed the problems, it is acting in an extremely scummy and we think unethical way as it tries to slither out of any responsibility. Before that, this video is brought to you by debacle and the new Zero Dark series of AK620 and AK400 CPU coolers. We previously reviewed the AK620 and AK400 and found them to be among a new crop of extremely competitive coolers for the price. The new Zero Dark and Zero Dark Plus variations move out to a blackout color design with blackout FDB fans. The heatsinks otherwise have the same characteristics as those that we tested previously and found to be well performing, just with a fresh new look. Learn more at the link in the description below. First, ASUS ships a BIOS that blasts SoC voltage and overshoots OCP in a way that degrades or just incinerates the chips. Next, ASUS ships a BIOS update that requires you to agree to void your warranty if you install it to stop the CPUs from exploding from their first fault. And it's actually kind of brilliant, because it's the quickest way to avoid all long-term liabilities on their balance sheet. And none of that is to mention ASUS's strong commitment to encourage users to just hit F5 and run defaults on their fancy $700 premium motherboards with their embedded controllers that do nothing useful at all, apparently, because they could stop these problems, but for some reason we're not using them the way that makes sense. So if that's the stupid game that we want to play, then we are happy to award ASUS with the stupid prize for the stupid game. We retested it with defaults, no EXPO, and it's not good.
Yeah, that's pretty disappointing, but we'll see, give it one more go here.
So there's a couple parts to this video. One is a brief technical benchmark. One is looking at the VSOC changes. Another one is looking at EXPO and ASUS's slimy behavior regarding warranties, BIOS updates where they're retconning things and retroactively changing the support list and trying to sweep stuff under the rug. Definitely check out the first video that's linked below. Again, it was a really fun educational video for us also, and it gets you all the basics for why this is happening. So first of all, again, ASUS has been posting all over the place about run defaults, so that's what we did. We did exactly what ASUS wanted. It didn't go well. It did not start well. So some of the memory kits we have actually won't even hold stable in auto with this board until EXPO is applied. We noticed these issues with some of the kits of memory and other boards as well. And so the reason is, without EXPO, if the kit requires, we think, a higher VDIM, which is different from VSOC, and you're not using EXPO, and the board is running an auto VDIM that's on the lower side, then it just straight up doesn't work. So actually, ASUS, in this instance, running defaults means not running at all, which we guess is a great way to never have to warranty a product because it just doesn't work. If that's what they want people to do, then we need to provide benchmarks to show you what you're giving up if you actually do that, genuinely. Like, that's the whole point of this, is all the benchmarks we ran, and probably everyone else, involved EXPO, because it is a big part of the CPUs on the platform, just like XMP is for Intel, but EXPO is more proportionally beneficial from what we've seen for AMD than perhaps XMP is in some instances for Intel. And so it matters here. And if any of you in the audience were like, okay, fine, I'll turn EXPO off, we want you to understand what you're giving up, because the benchmarks that we publish do not reflect that outcome. But before we go through those numbers, and before we talk about how ASUS is being an unethical scumbag of a company, we need to first start with the VSOC changes, because we've got some simple objective facts for that. So originally we observed a VSOC set point of about 1.341 volts, sometimes 1.35 volts with EXPO 1. ASUS has two EXPO profiles. One is EXPO 1, one is EXPO 2, and the EXPO profiles that they have, one of those is an ASUS optimized one, and it doesn't actually mean that it's using the two different profiles that can be on the stick. There can be two EXPO profiles on a stick, but that's not what ASUS's EXPO 1 and 2 mean. That would be too sensical. Instead, they have their own optimized one. With either of those, we're seeing 1.341 to 1.35 set, but that resulted in a 1.39 volt to 1.42 volts voltage when probed at the actual MLCC caps or at the VSOC checkpoints on the board when using EXPO. We tested that with a multimeter externally. As a reminder, again, that's not EXPO's fault. That's ASUS's fault. EXPO, the profiles, do not contain a VSOC set point. The board decides what to set. So the new BIOS version, which is 1410, the one that, we'll come back to this, voids the user's warranty to install, configures that to a 1.296 volt set, so about a 50 millivolt reduction from previously. This then results in a 1.3369 volt measurement at the socket with EXPO 1 and a G-Skill kit that we have. And with EXPO 2, we saw a 1.3381 volt result. With Corsair, we measured 1.34 volts. So for all of the panic and the much ado about BIOS for the last week, ASUS still couldn't get it right. It's still too high. AMD's official recommendation, or the cutoff now, is 1.3 volts, but the board vendors can still technically set whatever they want. So even though the AGESA update can lock down and start restricting the voltage, the problem is ASUS, their 1.3 number manifests itself as something like 1.34 volts. So it is still on the high side. By the way, 1.25 volts is fine for a lot of these kits that are on the market. So 1.3 is already kind of high, even if it landed there as the get or the outcome voltage. Because if you set, with this board, if you set EXPO through the AMD overclocking menu, as we said previously, it will result in a lower VSOC. So AMD's menu is setting a more appropriate VSOC than ASUS's own super advanced fancy premium menu. But the difference is that VDDIO is incorrect when setting it through AMD's menu, which results in instability and blue screens, whereas ASUS's menu just blasts all the voltages, so no problems anymore with stability until it starts dying. Then big problems with stability. That's not supposed to be like that. And this is where the scumbaggery begins. It's a new phrase, we're coining it now. ASUS's BIOS version 1410 is clearly marked as a beta BIOS, but in an instance like this one, people are panicking and they're going to update BIOS because that's what you should do. So beta and the disclaimers here, not really a fair thing to do with at least the way they wrote this disclaimer. This was posted as a rapid, panicked response on May 2nd. ASUS states these changes. 1. Update AGESA version to combo AM5 PI 1007. 2. Support 48 or higher density memory modules. 3. SoC voltage for Ryzen 7000 series limited to a maximum of 1.30 to protect the CPU and motherboard. That's not true, as we just showed you. And they also said this. Please note that this is a beta BIOS version of the motherboard, which is still undergoing final testing before its official release. The UEFI, its firmware, and all content found on it are provided on an as-is or as-available basis. Did you see that phrasing? We've already baked in the option where they're like, oops, the BIOS isn't on our support page anymore, just like all the other ones we pulled. Therefore, we're not supporting it. So if you've gone and installed it and you never look again because it's supposed to fix the issue because they told you it fixes the issue, and then they decide we're going to pull that BIOS, no longer supported. It doesn't count because it is not as available. ASUS does not give any warranties, they say, whether express or limited, as to the suitability, compatibility, or usability of the UEFI, its firmware, or any of its content, except as provided in the product warranty and to the maximum extent permitted by law. ASUS is not responsible for direct, special, incidental, or consequential damages resulting from using this beta BIOS. And that's not even to mention the fact that ASUS's BIOS was one of the first to be based on AGESA 1.0.0.7, but it's based on an internal test of the branch, and it wasn't meant to be public. It was an internal-only version of the BIOS. That's why it says beta everywhere. They weren't supposed to release it. ASUS, that's not how any of this works. You don't ship a product that kills other products which are attached to it and then ship an update that says, oopsie, now it won't kill the things that it attaches to anymore or itself, and it's resolved. But also, if you install this, you omit or forego your warranty. It's like it puts them in a better situation than if you just let the board kill the part with the original BIOS that was sold to you from Amazon or whatever, which we have some notes on that, by the way, too. Now, realistically, none of this actually gets upheld, and you could probably fight it as a consumer, and they would likely buckle because this is insane. ASUS here is doing something very dangerous for ASUS. What's the buzzword that they like internally? The brand credibility is suffering, something that ASUS builds its brand on, where actually saw a Reddit comment the other day where someone said, I'm glad I bought ASRock, which is like, whew, ASUS, that's a really bad place to be. So ASUS is demonstrating a complete lack of confidence here because they feel the need to make a legal CYA statement on something that itself is already a legal CYA statement. It's like a recursive cover your ass statement. Does the coverage get better, or does it start looping back around and become like the human lawyerpede or something? So this shows that ASUS recognizes it's rushing out firmware updates in dangerous ways. Firmware is one of the few things that has the power to just actually destroy parts if configured improperly, as we've already seen. That's not good. So if we clear CMOS...
You killed it the wrong way.
And ASUS clearly hasn't tested what it's putting out because it doesn't have the confidence to warrant what it's putting out. It's irresponsible for ASUS to even leave this BIOS live if they truly believe that it is such a risk. Either take away the no warranty disclaimer or take away the BIOS. Anything short of that is just, well, it's either panicked or it's conniving. And if it's panicked, then I don't want to be in a room with anyone from ASUS when there's an emergency, because they're going to panic. Now we get to the next part, which is ASUS seems to think that all users should just disable EXPO. Once again, and I keep coming back to the point because it's so crazy, and buy $500, $600, $7 motherboards that are far more expensive than they used to be, with a lot of features that aren't being leveraged properly, and then not use those features anyway because it would void the warranties and run at default. So we are happy to stop using EXPO in our reviews then to align with this new customer expectation. If the expectation from ASUS, and we would expect AMD, is no one should use EXPO, then we stop using EXPO. What we're about to show you here in benchmarks is a glimpse of that outcome. The problem we had with it was the digging heels in publicly in a big way on the no warranty provided. So we'll do it ASUS's way. We're retesting the 7000 series, the 7700X specifically, without EXPO, and it's gonna hurt AMD way more than it hurts Intel when XMP is disabled. And by the way, we tested Intel's XMP impact on the warranty process years ago at this point. Try to remember to link it below. And we couldn't get them to not honor the warranty even with XMP enabled. But the clear difference here is the repeated statements to stop using it and that it's overclocking. First one, Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p had the 7700X originally at 292 FPS average in the ASUS board, but because the intended use for this $340 CPU and a $700 motherboard is actually stock settings, we followed ASUS's advice and it fell to 252 FPS. So enabling the that's illegal setting of EXPO gives 16% more performance, but don't do that because it's not allowed. Likewise, 1% and 0.1% lows fell in step with the average. The 7700X is now actually worse than a 13600K, so by ASUS's own guidance, you should literally never buy a 7700X. We're sure AMD will appreciate ASUS's help with its marketing. In Cyberpunk, the 7700X's original 231 FPS average result is now invalid. Instead, we fall to 196 FPS. That means that EXPO was worth 18%, or enough to move the CPU from impressive mediocrity, hardly better than a 12100F, into being actually worth considering. The lows also fell with this change. With these new numbers, it becomes clear that an ASUS plus AMD combination is the last platform you should buy, and that's on their own recommendation. In Final Fantasy XIV, we lost 30 FPS off the top of the performance and averages, and not far from that in lows. The 7700X therefore falls to 201 FPS, which has it only 7% better than a 12100F. Knowing this, you should buy the 12100F instead. It's $240 cheaper than the $340 7700X, and the difference is 7%. So, once again, we're glad ASUS could clear that up for us, because that saves a lot of people a lot of money. They're actually being very altruistic here. One last one. In Far Cry 6, the 7700X fell from 171 FPS to 150, allowing the 13600A to completely trash the CPU in price and performance. ASUS is spearheading the best marketing campaign Intel has had in years. Remember, it's for those who dare. So here's the deal. The whole malicious compliance with ASUS's request thing, it's absurd. This entire thing we're doing right now, all of it is absurd because it's basically a parody. And it's a glimpse into, once again, if ASUS is going to say absurd things, then we will happily do those absurd things to prove a point. That's what this video is. So now we get into the next part. We are consistent with a statement of you shouldn't just trust a company to cover you. And if ASUS makes repeated explicit statements that it will not cover you in some of these scenarios, like the BIOS update really plainly spells out, hey, if something goes wrong because of our BIOS, fuck you and fuck your board. They really make it clear. So EXPO results in you apparently being cast aside at the first sign of trouble, and we believe them in that. It's not just some legalese on the box somewhere as a CYA like AMD's or Intel's statements about quote-unquote overclocking. It's the repeated, clear, explicit language that makes us trust ASUS to screw us. But that's not the only place ASUS had been scummy in the last week. We've received a lot of outreach from users, and a lot of that outreach include screenshots, logs, forwarded emails, and chats with ASUS customer support. And frankly, we're kind of horrified at the level of support that ASUS is providing. This isn't just the EXPO thing. Like, we've been getting these for a couple months now. We've noticed the increase in volume, and we were actually starting to work towards a content piece, and then it fell in our laps. So, first of all, when ASUS found out that we were buying their failed parts from users on the internet, our understanding is that they then went and effectively, our interpretation, tried to bribe those users by offering them not only the replacement of the dead part, but also something else that they wanted from the ASUS catalog. Maybe that's a divine gesture from ASUS to give back to those who dared to have their motherboard blow up. But our problem with it is that in the chat logs we've seen from users who hadn't expressed that we were there to then scoop up the parts, ASUS didn't make the same offers. So it starts to look like they're trying to prevent independent outlets from getting a hold of these things, which obviously too late, we've published that piece now, and trying to resolve it and sweep it under the rug. And yeah, it's a nice gesture to offer the users anything they want in return for the part when they know it's going to an independent outlet, but it is pretty, I mean, it reeks of an ulterior motive, and I just don't like it. It's that simple. So keeping the information out of the public eye, these companies like to offer a nebulous fix and then just go silent, never say anything again. Now, if you didn't notice, at the first sign of a failure publicly, this was before we started working on it, ASUS immediately pulled all of its older BIOS updates. The page was constantly in flux with small and large tweaks alike as the company panicked and went into full limitation of liability mode after a major fuck up with their OCP in combination with overvoltage. We also noticed that they were even retroactively changing their own updates to intentionally manipulate whether the BIOSes listed supported the X3D CPUs. So they'd post a BIOS revision with one set of notes, then retcon those notes quietly while also removing evidence of other prior BIOS versions, thus implying that users who installed the BIOS based on those notes are now out of compliance and warranty. ASUS has more warranty reversal engineers at this point than apparently actual electrical engineers who worked on the product. They're spending a lot of time trying to find ways to screw people out of a warranty. And by the way, I think we've made it clear we don't do the just trust ASUS thing, because that's why the written policies are there. That's the whole point. Now, fortunately, we have every BIOS ASUS has ever released for these boards saved because it's the one we use for our testing, and we're reconsidering that now. But here are some notables. BIOS version 0402 shipped on our new in-box board we just bought this past week, which is from actually that BIOS from last year, before the reviewer BIOS, from what we could see It didn't look like it was ever even a public release. BIOS version 0922 technically didn't support the X3D CPUs, but it was the last one right before their launch, and it had vCore enabled, by the way, for X3D. BIOS version 1101 was one of the first public BIOSes to support X3D CPUs. BIOS version 1202 was the only one ASUS left alive during the test of the initial X3D blowouts in our testing last week. And while we were setting up our platform for validation, we noticed ASUS made even more changes to its websites. Gems like this one stand out, where ASUS claims to support the 7000 X6D processors. Personally, I can't wait to get the new 6-dimensional 7000 series processor, because not only does the cache scale vertically, but it also scales across time, space, collective consciousness, and the astral plane. Truly revolutionary. ASUS's spiritual, spatial, and existential panic aside, they then updated the page again to list a new line item. Number 4, thermal monitoring mechanisms to help protect the CPU and motherboard. Also, the older BIOSes with manual vCore control were removed. We also found it incredibly shady when ASUS retconned the supported since a BIOS column on this page. It changed the support list from 1101, which was supported, to 1202. Now, to be fair, lies have to be intentional, but the line says validated since. It was validated since 1101, and just quietly retconning all of these things gaslights users into actually not being sure what they have anymore, what they've ever used in terms of what was supported with the CPUs and the boards, which is maybe the point. This shows it's either extremely, it's multiple things. It's extremely disorganized, it is misleading, it is shady and slimy, and this is not the way a brand that prides itself on being premium should be acting if it wants to sell $700 motherboards. And to be clear, taking down old BIOSes in and of itself isn't shady or slimy. Just disable a button and post a note with them that says they have a bug. Same with the CPU support table. Make a note, say why it changed and what it used to be, with maybe a strike through rather than gaslighting the users. Say that the early support for these was bugged in the older version and might destroy your CPU. So it at least helps someone to know what happened and if they should upgrade. And then just list the current version for support. ASUS also posted this statement on its Facebook page, preempting AMD's own statement originally and our initial video. Quote, several AMD Ryzen 7000 X3D owners have reported CPU and motherboard failures. Ryzen 7000 X3D processors do not allow for CPU ratio or CPU core voltage tuning. Quick interruption, they actually then parenthetically define this as overclocking. Close enough. But actually they did. So originally, if you bought a board off Amazon and it had not the exact correct BIOS from ASUS at the time, and you put an X3D CPU in there, it will allow overvolting. Ask me how I know. When you get the purple numbers, it's good. They say, but they do allow for performance tuning and DRAM overclocking via PBO2 and EXPO memory. To support EXPO and or memory overclocking, DDR5 6000 and beyond, SoC voltage has to be sufficiently increased to ensure compatibility and stability. The amount of voltage required varies between CPU samples. Some processors are more sensitive to overvoltage than others, and some are capable of running at higher memory frequencies without needing as much voltage. As confirmed with AMD, any intentional manipulation of these settings can damage the processor, socket, and motherboard. Now, just to be clear, that line was intentional manipulation of these settings. It's an important line. So this is actually insane, because no reasonable user will expect that a heavily marketed and relied upon feature being turned on is intentional manipulation of a setting that will cause the CPU to explode. That is not a reasonable thing to say from ASUS. The easiest example is if you get into your car and it has a sport mode and you switch it to sport mode and then the car explodes. There's no middle step. You turn it to sport mode and kaboom. It's not like you're modding the computer in the car and you're unlocking things that are inherently locked down that you need to then go and manually turn off. This isn't actually real overclocking, even if we want to interpret it this way. And this is where it comes down to a scenario of death of the author. If you're not familiar with the phrase, death of the author suggests that as an author puts out a published work, if the public then interprets that author's meaning in a different way than the author had intended, it sort of becomes irrelevant what the author had intended. And in this scenario, what matters is that no reasonable user thinks EXPO, first of all, EXPO doesn't change VSOC. That's the motherboard vendor doing that. They are correct that higher VSOC than 1.0, which is default, is required to get stability, but not necessarily 1.35 or whatever they want to set. But either way, a reasonable user will not expect that EXPO on, which is heavily marketed, advertised, and relied upon in AMD's first-party benchmarks and ASUS's, will then kill the product. Not only that, but AMD explicitly went on record with us to state that if your CPU dies from this failure, which is inclusive, by the way, to EXPO, it is in fact covered under their warranty. They will replace the CPU. They told us that directly. They'll even pay for shipping, like your car. It's absolutely warranted if you turn on sport mode and it explodes. All of this posturing is totally unnecessary, and it's what has us so frustrated. It is, bringing it back, therefore not reasonable for ASUS to accuse the user of intentionally manipulating a setting which is not being intentionally changed. ASUS is the only one that is intentionally manipulating VSOC here. It's their setting to change with that profile. Now, we emailed ASUS to ask about the statement. Here's what we said. The short version is that we wanted to know specifically what ASUS meant when it said intentional manipulation. When ASUS gave us its intentionally manipulative response, it said this, quote, "Thanks for reaching out. The update we released was an in-progress statement we wanted to provide to the community and partners alongside coordination with AMD PR. Let's find the closest bus and drag them under it. The wording you refer to is from an NDA, or non-disclosure agreement, AMD guidance advisory concerning voltage, as noted in our statement, as confirmed with AMD. Please reach out to AMD for additional clarification in this respect. The new UEFI builds with a new maximum available SoC voltage limit of 1.3 have been pushed out and are available to download on our service and support website." First of all, so that was sent to us before the new 1410 version was released, and the BIOS that was available at the time that we got that email did not stop at 1.3 volts. It was still really high. So that was actually just objectively not true. So that's quick to move on from. This is a nice catch-22 otherwise, because they're basically saying AMD briefed us under NDA. Ask AMD what that detail was. And by the way, we, ASUS, are breaching our NDA by telling you we were under NDA for these details. So we did reach out to AMD. We sent them the thread and said, hey, why don't we all just be aware of what one party's saying of the other? And while we did not receive an official answer, our understanding is that ASUS's statement was posted of their own volition and independently. So we thought it was interesting that this is how they handled it. ASUS here is avoiding any responsibility, and that's the sad part, because ASUS is a brand that has the brand presence and power and money to come out and turn this into a massive marketing win. All they had to do was come out and say, look, we get it, we've seen that some of these parts are dying in our boards, and we don't expect that they should die, but if they do, here's what we're doing. Step one, we're updating BIOS. You'll want to grab that as soon as we're done panicking, running around headlessly and uploading a bunch of shit to our website that might break your stuff. Grab the next BIOS that's actually good. And step two, if a part does die, in writing right now, we are committing to replacing those parts if they die in this fashion. That's all they really had to do here. A huge win. And this video wouldn't really need to exist. It'd be about probably Gigabyte or ASRock instead. It's not even the main concern. I mean, obviously, our main concern now is ASUS has eroded any and all trust that it had accumulated up until this point, and it needs to earn it back. And secondarily, this whole warranty thing about you all know how we feel about these types of statements. They are not just saying, trust us, they're saying the opposite. They're explicitly saying if you use this BIOS, we're not supporting you, but also you need to use this BIOS. And by the time this video goes up, there's going to be another BIOS. So maybe they changed the tune, but they've kind of shown their colors at this point. We have plenty of other complaints. I mean, Armory Crate is still baked into the motherboard, so that's your day zero exploit waiting to happen in the future. XMP 1 and 2 and EXPO 1 and 2 don't mean the first and second profiles on the stick, which is the only thing they should ever mean. They also now have another option called EXPO Tweaked, because apparently the first two weren't enough. And again, there was the VDDIO issue. So, this video, the tone, obviously, the first one was very objectively focused on let's find the problem. But seeing the response to the problem, it becomes more of a social issue and less of a technical one. And that's why it becomes more hyperbolic in the reporting, because we're in a scenario where these are absurdist responses from ASUS, and they deserve an absurdist response from the media to hopefully show them, hey, you are being absurd. Why are you being absurd? So 1410 didn't fix the issues entirely. They lowered the VSOC, yes, but there are still issues present. And concerned about ASUS's level of support, but we're looking into that too. So check back for that sometime in the future. Hopefully you enjoyed the rant, but we'll see if it does anything. That's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersaccess.net to grab a shirt like this one to support us directly and our rants. And we'll see you all next time.